So at this point, I'd like to introduce Phil Lacovara. One of the interesting things about the story of Captain La Rue is that it could have ended on so many occasions in a different way. We see that sort of in the great movie, It's a Wonderful Life. Things could have changed so differently if he wouldn't have fallen into the frozen water. And so because of that, I gave that idea to Phil to work with because of the great work that he did on producing the book. So I'd like to introduce to you Phil Lacovara.
Well, I'm very fortunate that Father and Captain Hope woke everybody up after lunch, so now no one's going to be dozing during my talk, so we'll see how that goes. So as Father said, the title and theme of this talk was suggested by our friends Father Sinclair and Doreen. The marvelous Frank Capra movie, It's a Wonderful Life, tells of all the good things that would not have happened if the protagonist, George Bailey, had never been born. I will be talking about many of the events in Captain La Rue's life that might have prevented him from loading his ship with refugees in Hung Nam 75 years ago. So Leonard La Rue served on 25 ships over a 20-year career, 15 in his first decade. It's a little hard to see, but the left is his particulars of sea surface from his official Coast Guard file. His first was the USS Annapolis, a 1,172-ton gunboat commissioned in 1897 that had served in the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American Wars. Decommissioned in 1919, the ship was turned over to the Philadelphia Nautical School, where cadets lived and learned aboard the ship year-round. The Annie took La Rue and his fellow cadets on summer cruises to the Caribbean and the Mediterranean in 1932 and 1933. On graduating in 1934, A.B. La Rue served on the SS Francis E Powell of the Atlantic Refining Company. Long after he had left that ship, Powell was sunk early in the war off the coast of Virginia by U-130. In fact, 4 more of the ships on which La Rue served during the 1930s were sunk during the war: Dixie Sword, Extavia, Steelmaker, and Steel Voyager. Just at the closing days of peace for the United States, La Rue signed aboard as third mate aboard the Lykes Brothers SS Cranford. Under charter from the British Ministry of War Transport, she sailed between the U.S. and South Africa and India, returning with a load of Indian jute on December 7th. La Rue signed off Cranford on December 26th. When Cranford was sunk by a U-boat 6 months later, 11 officers and men died, including the captain, who had given La Rue a very good evaluation of his service, and La Rue's replacement as third mate, Hein Jorgensen. La Rue's next ship, on which he served more than a year, the SS Mormackmar, marked his arrival at Moore McCormick Lines, where he would serve for the remainder of his career. Here she is just before the war, with big American flags painted on her sides to signal her neutrality to prowling U-boats. But now the war was on not just for Britain, but for the U.S. as well. On January 31st, 1942, Mormackmar was ordered, along with 16 other vessels, to load at Boston or Philadelphia for Archangel, Russia. Mormackmar was going to Murmansk. So why, even today, does the name Murmansk strike fear in the hearts of merchant mariners? It's because, unlike the normal passage across the Atlantic where you just had to worry about submarines, since the Murmansk route necessarily passed close to Nazi-occupied Norway, the enemy offered a triple threat of commerce raiders like the battleship Tirpitz here that could hide in Norwegian fjords and pop out to attack shipping, as well as land-based bombers. Each ship in the convoy was outfitted with units of the Naval Armed Guard to try to fend off German attacks. But the North Atlantic, the Norwegian Sea, and the Barents Sea were inhospitable to interlopers, particularly in the winter. Mormackmar, with La Rue as second mate, sailed from Boston on February 18th to join convoy HX-177. By the time the ship joined the convoy, it had already been an eventful voyage. While loading in Boston, the officer in charge of the Naval Armed Guard had felt it necessary to call the FBI, the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Army, anyone he could find, to remove 4 members of the ship's crew for drunkenness, incompetency, insubordination, threatening to kill various members of the ship's company, and generally causing unrest. After leaving Boston, but while still in U.S. waters, the ship detoured to Portland, Maine, and the captain was relieved and replaced. During the Atlantic crossing, she suffered a breakdown in the engine room and dropped out of her position at the rear of the convoy, already a tenuous spot. A few hours later, she was back on course and speed, but now barrels of white phosphorus, secured on the weather deck, broke loose from the ship's motion and began rolling about the deck. The lids broke loose and the phosphorus ignited spontaneously on contact with the seas breaking over the decks and started a large fire. After hours of effort by all hands, including the armed guards, the barrels were resecured. Mormackmar eventually caught up with the convoy and continued on to an intermediate stop at Loch Ewe, Scotland, and then as convoy PQ-13 on to Reykjavik, Iceland, where the part of the crew was now in near mutiny over the conditions on the ship and the dangerous cargo, which had broken loose once again in heavy seas on the way to Iceland. After a day of back and forth between the crew and the U.S. naval authorities, the ship departed with the convoy for Murmansk with a bosun and 2 ABs left behind in the naval brig under the control of U.S. Marines. After first braving floating mines, for the next several days, the convoy came under attack by German aircraft, destroyers, and U-boats, with the destroyers sinking 3 ships and U-boats 2. Fortunately, Mormackmar was not hit, but near misses from the destroyer shells blew open the door to an officer's cabin and broke 3 bearing caps on her propeller shaft. When PQ-13 arrived in Murmansk at 01:30 on March 31st, they were no doubt relieved, but probably also shocked when the sun rose and they saw the bleak side of the port, which had been repeatedly bombed with explosives and incendiaries, burning most of the city. The nearest German-controlled airfield was just 20 minutes away by air, and during the month it took the Russians to unload the ship, 2 more members of PQ-13 were sunk at their berths during one of the many air raids. On April 28th, convoy QP-11 formed up to return. Of the 18 ships that had left Iceland, 5 had been sunk en route and 2 at pierside. As QP-11 steamed westward, U-456 blew off part of the stern of the cruiser HMS Edinburgh. And on the morning of May 1st, the convoy came under attack by a quartet of bombers, with Mormackmar seeing them first and opening fire. The effective fire held them off, but that afternoon a pair of German destroyers swooped in to attack. A torpedo missed Mormackmar 600 yards astern, but hit and sank the lone Soviet merchantman in the convoy. The picture, by the way, is not of QP-11, but of the unfortunate eastbound PQ-17. 2 months later, where 25 out of the convoy's 35 ships would be lost between Iceland, just between Iceland and the USSR. The picture, by the way, is taken from a German bomber. La Rue stayed on a second mate aboard Mormackmar for the rest of the year and into 1943, sailing around the globe. The ship was not yet done trying to kill him. In addition to dodging U-boats across the Atlantic to Africa, La Rue braved sandstorms in the Persian Gulf and Japanese submarines in the Indian Ocean. Once in Calcutta, after frequent air raid warnings, Mormackmar had the honor of enduring the first actual bombing of the Hooghly docks and the rest of the port on December 20th. If that wasn't enough, Mormackmar's rudder post came loose in heavy seas south of Tasmania and began vibrating severely. She had to put into Wellington for repairs, where her just offloaded cargo of burlap, hemp, and jute caught fire in the warehouse alongside the ship, and the ship had to be moved from the berth so she would not be damaged by the intense flames. In the middle of 1943, La Rue signed on as chief mate aboard the Liberty ship Joseph Medill, having received his license as master of steam and motor vessels for any tonnage, any oceans, on May 11th. He later served as the chief mate aboard the diesel-powered C-1A freighter Mormackdale, carrying cargo around the Pacific. As the war wound down, La Rue finally got his own command, first on the Liberty ships Smith Thompson and George B. McClellan, and then on the Victory ship Whittier Victory. This ship would be highly consequential to the life of Leonard La Rue and that of brother Marinus, OSB. After victory in the Pacific, La Rue commanded Whittier Victory, now in Mormac colors, on a regular route between the ports of the east coast of the U.S. and ports in South America. In December 1946, Whittier Victory embarked a group of Benedictine monks during a stop in Trinidad, who were the monks on their way back to their home at the monastery of St. Benedict in Bahia, Brazil. Interestingly, La Rue had visited the Benedictine monastery where the monks had been staying in Trinidad during his Caribbean cruise as a cadet aboard the Annie. During the 2 weeks the monks spent aboard the ship, Captain La Rue struck up a friendship with their leader, the Swiss-born Reverend Vicente Lautenschlager. They no doubt spoke often of their shared Catholic faith, and when La Rue shook his hand as the priest left the ship, as we see in the picture, the Benedictine told him the merchant marine was no vocation for him. Next comes a story that, while not potentially life-ending, could have been career-ending. On the evening of February 16, 1948, Whittier Victory left La Pointe Terminal in Vancouver in a heavy blizzard, bound for the Strait of Georgia and south to San Francisco, when she struck a boom of logs towed by a tug of the M.R. Cliff Tugboat Company. The company claimed in the press that the ship seemed to go berserk for nearly 2 hours in the snowstorm. That same night, another freighter cut another boom, also sending logs adrift. It is unclear exactly what happened. Cliff Tugboat Company subsequently sued Moore McCormick Lines for $20,000 in damages. There was no further press on the matter, so it's likely the suit was settled outside of Admiralty Court. We don't know whether Mormac blamed Captain La Rue or not, but after he signed off Victory for the last time, Whittier Victory for the last time in June 1948, his next assignment was not as master, but as first officer on the turboelectric ship Uruguay, carrying passengers and cargo from New York to Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. As the crew menu shows, even if he was not in charge, he probably ate a lot better than any previous posting. He also had time when he was off watch to take Spanish lessons. In any event, after taking his penance aboard the Uruguay, La Rue got his command back, first in the Liberty Deborah Gannett, and then on the C-2 Mormac Wren. La Rue signed off the Wren on May 5th, 1950. Just a month and a half later, while La Rue was on leave in Philadelphia, Kim Il-sung sent his troops across the 38th parallel. By the time La Rue signed on as master of the Meredith Victory on July 28th, North Korean forces had seized almost the entire Korean peninsula, but plans were already afoot for how to retake the lost territory. La Rue and his crew, including his junior third officer, Henry J.B. Burley Smith, picked up the ship from the James River Reserve Fleet and sailed past the Virginia Capes for the Panama Canal and the Pacific. As she sailed to Oakland to load supplies, the Defense Department announced it would increase U.S. troop strength to 70,000. The 42,000 tons of monthly sea lift that would require meant that another 45 reserve Victory ships would also be activated in addition to the Meredith Victory. Meredith Victory, loaded with 10 Sherman tanks, 250 2.5-ton trucks, and 150 tons of ammunition, anchored in Yokohama at the end of August after having crossed the 5,300-mile Great Circle in just 13 days, the speed of advance of about 17 knots. While she was waiting to unload her cargo, the strongest storm to hit Japan since 1943, Typhoon Jane, struck Kobe on September 3rd, packing winds of 110 miles per hour. The storm destroyed thousands of homes, killed 250 Japanese, and snapped the mooring lines and anchor chains of 8 ships, including 7 American. After the storm had passed, Meredith Victory left her anchorage to discharge part of her cargo and load additional 30-ton Shermans and 9-ton Deuce and a Halves. What did not fit in the holds was chained to the weather deck. On September 11th, she left Yokohama as part of the 19 ships of the second echelon group of the Incheon invasion, 120 GIs accompanying her cargo, with no place to sleep but under the canvas covers of their trucks. 2 days later, as the invasion force was steaming south of the Tsushima Strait, a second hurricane, Typhoon Kizia, roared across southern Japan. With the heavy tanks and trucks on deck, Meredith Victory had a particularly hard time with the 50-foot swell and 60-ton winds on the fourth quarter, as Burley told you. Burley had the watch that night. The ship rolled heavily with chains breaking and trucks and tanks sliding to the bulwarks. As the wind, waves, and weight heeled the ship alarmingly to starboard, before Burley could call the captain, La Rue appeared on the bridge. Silently timing the waves and motion of the ship, La Rue calmly ordered the helmsman hard left rudder and told Smith to order full ahead. After perilously turning her beam to the seas, the ship steadied on course at slow ahead with her bow to the seas. After the storm passed through, Meredith Victory resumed course, arriving at her assigned anchorage 3 hours late, but with her crew and cargo intact. The commander of the amphibious force, Admiral Doyle, who had to order several ships to continue to the objective and not return as they wanted to Yokohama, said later that Kizia was one of the worst storms he had ever encountered. How to follow up Incheon. With the 8th Army driving up the west coast of Korea through Seoul, MacArthur adopted a hammer and anvil strategy, landing the 10th Corps, composed primarily of the 1st Marine Division and the 7th Infantry Division, at Wonsan in late October after several weeks of painstaking mine clearance. 10th Corps quickly joined 8th Army in pushing through North Korea towards the Manchurian border at the Yalu River. But MacArthur had ignored warnings about approaching the border, and the Chinese entered the war in force with more than 10 divisions by the end of November. Hence the famous fighting retreat from the area of the Chosin Reservoir and the evacuation of 100,000 soldiers and Marines and about 18,000 vehicles. While all this was going on, Meredith Victory was busy shuttling supplies around the theater, including Hungnam, where the evacuation, what Admiral Doyle called an amphibious landing in reverse, was soon taking shape. When Meredith Victory approached Hungnam on December 20th, the port held many hazards for La Rue and his crew. As at Wonsan, the North Koreans had heavily mined the port, and when the Allied minesweepers finished clearing Wonsan at the end of October, they started a month of work at Hungnam, clearing 2 channels along the coast and 1 straight into the inner harbor. Here you see Shenzhen Maru, her holds full of flour for the 10th Corps' bakers, which arrived on December 6th without proper charts. She missed the swept channel, blundered into the minefield, and struck a moored contact mine at 3 in the morning. A few days later, the Enid Victory ran aground leaving the port. While Chinese and North Korean artillery bombarded the port and the surrounding areas, not all the flying shells came from land. That's the cruiser USS St. Paul providing naval fire support, holding the enemy at bay as 10th Corps slowly allowed the perimeter to shrink, reaching just 2,000 yards from the beach by the time the refugees were boarding. Fortunately, even though the crew could hear the 8-inch shells from the St. Paul and the cruiser USS Rochester, and later 16-inch shells from the battleship Missouri, there were no short rounds. Meredith Victory anchored outside the inner harbor to wait for its time to load. Inside the breakwater were berths for 8 or 9 Victory-sized ships, although one was permanently occupied by the USS Foss, or turbo-electric destroyer escort providing power for the 10th Corps facilities. Ammunition, troops, equipment, and even some refugees were loaded onto tenders or LSTs on the adjacent beaches, you can see down at the bottom. And La Rue and his crew had plenty of waiting. There's the captain with our late friend Bob Lunny on the left, and Burley Smith operating the Aldous light on the right. I think you've probably seen that picture 3 times now today. So it was not until 15:30 on the 22nd of December that Meredith Victory received orders to proceed to a berth, where she moored outside another ship, the Norkuba, so that refugees had to cross over on hastily built platforms. I think we decided that in that ship on the right, that's Chief Mate Savastio, we think, directing or counting, right? Burley, counting the refugees as they came aboard.
I doubt if anyone ever counted.
I think he probably lost count after 1,000, right? At 21:30, the refugees began boarding. By 03:30 on the 23rd, holds 2 and 5 were filled to capacity, with number 4 filled by 0500 and number 1 filled just before sunrise. The remaining hold was filled, and at 11:10, the last refugee boarded the Meredith Victory. As the ship cleared Hungnam waters around 1450 and turned south, her decks and holds filled with human beings, she still had hazards to face. In addition to the risks simply attendant to being on the sea, there were still floating mines in the area that the ship could strike. Other risks were internal. The crew found to its horror that a group of refugees had started a fire in one of the holds in an attempt to keep warm. What the Koreans didn't know was that the fire sat above hundreds of barrels of aviation gas that the Meredith Victory had carried to Hungnam and not been allowed to unload. The fire was extinguished. Unknown to the crew was that one of their Moormack sister ships had experienced a similar near disaster a few days earlier, when refugees had started the engines of trucks in the Moormack Moon's hold for heat, and 50 men were overcome by fumes and had to be carried onto the deck and revived. Christmas finally came for the refugees and for Captain La Rue and his crew, as the refugees were safely offloaded onto ROK LSTs for the final leg of the journey to dry land. So Captain La Rue had one more command before he left his merchant mariner life for an even more wonderful life. That was a life in service of God as a Benedictine monk. And I will remark to you that that quote down the bark of St. Peter was actually a quote from Brother Marinus to one of his former shipmates, talking about how he had left the sea for the bark of St. Peter. Thank you very much.